I have this conversation often, and I think Andrew does too, about
Mhm.
where to save some money, and this is all about that.
Yeah, stop the IT spend bleed, or Andrew likes to call it stop the bleed.
Yes.
Everybody likes that, right? No one likes to spend money they don't want to have to, or no one likes losing money.
Well, and it's understanding, money in all different shapes and forms, right? There's the money that hits your P&L, then there's lost productivity, and so understanding that it's all money coming out of your pocket one way or another, and being able to identify that.
So today's discussion, clearly, we just want to focus on like the top three areas that really kind of bleed businesses dry if they're not paying attention, and we'll go through those, um, and start talking about how to optimize service without like downgrading it. Because a lot of people think, oh, to save money, I got to lose a bunch of stuff. Um, and then really just getting more out of what you're investing in IT and making sure that you're doing that and giving people a way to get that. And as always, we'll have a nice giveaway at the end. So if you stick around, and this video will go up on Succurri's YouTube channel. We post a lot of different topics around, there are six of them here. This one happens to be under IT leadership. So a lot of different topics going out on YouTube. Um, and you can subscribe to our channel, youtube.com/@Succurri, and that will get you to our YouTube channel. So that's a great way to stay in touch with these things that we do every month. Uh, I have conversation with Grant and Andrew separate from these that we also put out videos. So we're just adding to that library, a lot of great topics out there. So go ahead and subscribe and like. So, Andrew, what is this thing, the IT bleed, the IT spend bleed? Tell me what it involves.
Yeah, so in the IT spend or the IT bleed, and actually the bleed can happen in any part of your business, but I'm really good about the IT side of things. So it's those unforeseen costs and the deferred costs that you can't really put a finger on. So and I don't want to overstep on the order of the slideshow, but basically it's several major things. So it's like your IT equipment and your lifecycle management. So if you have old equipment, it runs slower. Your people are less efficient. If you have equipment that's old, it breaks. You have unexpected downtime. So those are things. If you have expenses for an event that happens that you could avoid, like a breach or a malware attack, there's costs, right? That you cost to run your business, loss of revenue, and so forth. So, so I'll just go through this list here. So you have your unforeseen costs, you have your deferred costs. So unforeseen, like I said, is that person's computer crashes, and now you have the expense of that person not being productive that day. We call that your basically your IT bleed for the day. You have your deferred costs, which are the costs of not maintaining your systems so that they're running optimally. You have potential for those internal mistakes that people make. You lose efficiency, right? If you are not watching things, and that has a cost to it. Your performance expectations aren't aligned with your reality, and sometimes you're overpaying for extra stuff like licensing and technology that you don't need. We recently had a customer that was paying for $5,000 laptops, and we recommend like a $2,000 laptop, but their perception was they needed a $5,000 laptop. So were they getting more value for that than necessary? Probably not. Also, there's a lot of licensing out there that we find people ultimately spend a ton of money on orphaned licenses that they can't track effectively. And so, those are the things that we really look for when we're talking about IT bleed at a high level.
It's really common sense stuff, right?
Well,
Um,
like I tell a lot of people, a lot of clients, is that just because you're not paying for it doesn't mean it doesn't cost you something, right? And so
yeah.
Mhm.
that's the mentality that you have to get past, is like, hey, whether IT costs the same amount no matter what to any industry, to any company, that expense is there. And just because you sweep it underneath the rug doesn't mean you're not paying for it. It just means that you're going to have to pay for it at some point, or you're paying for it in a different form. And sometimes the ones that are the hard ones are, I deferred it so long that it blew up in my face, and now it's 10 times more expensive than it would have been just to maintain it. Or where you're kind of, it doesn't show up in my IT expense because some operational person is doing the job for me at potentially more expensive than what it costs to have just the IT group do it. So you're paying for it no matter what. That expense doesn't go away. It's just where it shows up on your P&L.
Running a business today, a successful one, takes technology, the use of technology, and it's like any other part of your business, whether it's marketing and sales or finance. If you don't have the right people doing those, doing those things for you that are trained and professional at those things, you have someone else who may not know everything that a professional would know. And so having people in the right role, doing the right work that they're trained to do, makes you more efficient.
Well,
technology is certainly.
Here's an example of that. So I built Legos as a kid. That doesn't make me qualified to build buildings today, right? So, I get the understanding I can stack some blocks, I get some structure understanding, but that doesn't make me qualified to build something. And it's the same for IT, right? So, yeah, maybe I have an employee that is techie and likes to play around with computers. That doesn't necessarily make them qualified to be able to do some of these IT tasks.
Not a master builder, Grant?
I'm not a master builder, right? I watch some law television shows, but it doesn't make me qualified to practice law, right? So
yeah,
same concepts.
So there's a bunch of different places. Let's talk about the top three, the ones you guys always deal with, and we'll kind of go in order of severity. So when you talk about vendor management, why is that a place of hidden cost?
I'll run with that one. Yeah. So
yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, one of the things that people don't understand or have a hard time getting through is like the time suckage thing, how long it takes to actually do something. And when it comes to like vendor management, I like to throw the ISPs underneath the bus because they're pretty easy to do so, but also they're massive time suckage. So when I have this conversation of like who's doing your vendor management, typically it's like the operations manager that's dealing with it, maybe the owner that's dealing with this vendor management. And there's a common response when I ask like, hey, who's dealing with the ISP? And I get the eyes kind of rolling back in the back of their head. I'm like, yes, I get it. You probably, every time you have to call them, you'd rather, shoot yourself or, place destroying yourself X, Y, Z right here. Because it's hours of your time. Like you just assume the moment you pick up the phone, you've got 2 hours of pulling your hair out until you actually get to the person that you want to talk to that can solve your problem. And even then they may not be able to solve it. So that's when you have your operations manager or your owner or higher level people, those are some of the most expensive people in your organization, and they're not necessarily qualified to hop on those calls. Like the vendor's probably asking them questions that they can't answer. And so going back to having IT doing functions that they're qualified for and trained for, I'm going to tell you, I can do it for 5 times less than an operations manager or an owner. That's just the math that it works out. Yeah. I can always do it for cheaper because I have somebody that's trained in that position to be able to do that. So having your most expensive employee doing some of these functions costs money. Whether it shows up on a P&L or not is a different story, but it's expensive.
Yeah, and before we move on to the next one, Tony, I know we're on this webinar, we're working to have like really practical examples. So Grant mentioned 2 hours. So I will tell you that probably 2 hours is pretty conservative as far as how long it takes to get an ISP to fix an issue. Like we usually sit on the phone for an hour on hold before we even get to anybody. So let's assume that this one person in your office has spent 4 hours like dealing with the issue. They make $35 an hour. So like you got $140 of employee cost into that phone call, right? And hopefully they resolved it. That was probably impacting all the staff at some level because your internet wasn't working right. So, multiply that amount of time by those people. And, you take on top of that what it would cost, like what that employee would have produced in value for the organization, right? Doing their real job. So all of a sudden, like vendor management's really expensive. So you're going to have like a couple $100 to $500 per one of these events. So you then start to add those up day after day after day or month after month, and you're burning cash, right? You're bleeding cash that you can't see. So as you go through these, I'm going to kind of highlight the math equation for each one of these.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I think it's worth getting people to think that way, because we don't. We're like, oh, what came out of my bank account today? Or, what what do I got to make to, make payroll? Oh, I made payroll. Everything's, everything's going great. Or, I'm not underwater. And so you have kind of this survival mentality where you step over, a dollar to get to a nickel. Like, oh, I'll do this myself because I'm saving money. I'm not paying somebody. But depending on how proficient you are at these things, your time should be spent doing something else.
Well, like I said,
It
an
takes
owner,
the right
yeah,
mindset.
yeah, an owner or management member are some of the most expensive people in your organization. So those people doing those types of remedial tasks is a really expensive way to solve that problem. And back to Andrew, back to your comment, I'm going to continue to lowball numbers all the way through this webinar. The reason why is that the equation works itself out, right? So me pointing out that it maybe takes 2 hours, they're like, wow, it probably took me 4. So I want to make sure that when the numbers stick out, even in the lowball numbers, that they really understand that the multiplier is where you have to pay attention to. And we'll you'll see it down throughout the call, but it's the math is undeniable.
We should really call it the invisible IT bleed, because that's what happens. It's not in a bank account somewhere or on a check somewhere. And so it seems like it's invisible, but there's a cost there.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about licensing management. What does that mean?
So I can take that one. So as we get into as the world changes more to a subscription and licensing model for software, now we're all paying monthly, right? We're paying for what we consume. We're paying per license or per site, per processor, depending on your licensing. So all of a sudden, what was previously like a once every 3 or 4 or 5 year purchase for like a fixed license or like a perpetual license, we're now paying monthly for a subscription license. There's a couple of things here that this is where the bleeding really happens. So now, before, you were having an approval process because the perpetual license was expensive, and people had to really think about it and make a decision to buy it. The subscription licensing now has become so commonplace that there's no one who's really looking at that on a regular basis, because they're like, I can't manage all these licenses. I can't be aware of all of them for every time I have a new employee or an employee goes. And so the accounts payable team just pays the bill, right? So the gates are now open for money to flow out, whereas they were like a really solid approval process previously. The vendors also, and I'll use some examples, but like 2 of the biggest vendors out there that we all buy licensing from have models that make it really hard to keep track of your licensing. So like, Microsoft 365, which we do a ton of business with, the majority of your licensing with them is an annual commitment. If you miss that annual commitment and you get renewed, like you're stuck in that licensing for a year. You may only have 10 employees, but now you have 20 licenses you're shouldering. So
Right.
You're basically doubling your cost because no one could see what was going on. No one was watching it. There's another vendor, which I will not say their name because I think this is a dirty trick that they play, but they advertise individual licenses for their productivity software that are less expensive. And everyone buys the less expensive individual license because they're like, oh, I'm going to buy the less expensive license. What happens though is every time one of those licenses is purchased, a credit card is put on file to back up that cost. And so the accounts payable person sees like transaction after transaction after transaction each month for this type of licensing. And there's just so much of it that they like give up, right? So they're just like, I'll just pay the bill. Well, the employee leaves and that license was associated with that employee. And that license is usually an annual commitment, but it's tied to that employee's email address. The employee leaves, their email gets wiped away, the license is now orphaned. And accounts payable just keeps paying. And so what we've found is when we get into those situations for this specific vendor, we know we actually go through a process of finding all their orphaned licensing, because the customer will say like, you guys have to figure out our licensing for this vendor. And so we go and find all the orphaned licensing, roll it into the more expensive Teams account, and then we can see everything and we can allocate licenses more effectively. But if you look at it from that standpoint, like if you're paying $40 a month for a license that no one's using and you multiply that by 5, 10, 20, you're bleeding cash and getting no value from it.
Well, so before I pull up the third one, we'll have a chance to go into each one of these and start talking like practical approach and how to look at it. So we'll get a dive in it. We'll do some math. But I just wanted people to understand kind of the top 3 that we see. And this one is a big one. We've already mentioned it a little bit, this employee inefficiency. And it tends to be around the technology they're using and how well that technology is working, i.e. computers, or it could be software, but most of the time it's computers or a network, that makes them slow. Although Grant, you brought up a point when we were kind of prepping for the conversation about everybody's sold that they need more bandwidth, and that might not necessarily be the truth. And that one kind of floored me a little bit. I was like, oh, I'm that guy. I'm the guy that just goes,
that's what they're
buy
sold.
more band, give me more pipe, babe.
That's what they're sold, right? The ISP says, I'm going to give you more bandwidth. And ironically enough, bandwidth is the one part of the equation that doesn't necessarily equal speed. Speed comes from latency or low latency and low jitter. Most people run you got your large ISPs out there that all they do is pitch bandwidth. They never talk about how efficient it is. And so you look at it and most people are using, 10% of their already paid for bandwidth. And then they're like, hey, I need more bandwidth. I'm like, why? More bandwidth isn't making that service go any faster. You can move more data, but you're not moving the data in the first place. So that's another bleed. That's a different type of bleed. I don't know if we're necessarily talking about it today, but yeah, there's having somebody able to take a look at that and saying, no, in fact, you can actually pay for less bandwidth and save some money because you're not using what you have now.
But that's the whole point of having professionals in IT that know all this stuff. Most people know it at a surface level, but you guys really understand it. And employee efficiency is a big one, because who here hasn't complained about, oh my gosh, my computer's not working, or is this running slow? That's the other one that I hear on chat sometimes. Is this thing running slow for everybody? Oh yeah. And then everybody kind of piles on and all right, well, and then what do you do when that happens? You just go, all right, well, I'm going to go do something else until this thing gets fixed.
that chat session alone, you think how much time and money is spent in just people talking about how slow their computer is. To be honest, I'm completely floored that Microsoft doesn't actually call you and tell you that you're over provisioned with your licensing. So that's, I'm joking. Like Microsoft's never going to call you.
So. Yeah. If you're watching and listening, they're not going to call. So let's dive into vendor management. We did go a little bit in there, but just kind of some basics. If you were to say, hey, look, when if you don't have this IT support like Succurri provides for this right now, what are some of the things that you can do to um, to kind of understand if there's some bleed happening here, and maybe what are some practical tips? I just pulled all three up and that we had talked about, but maybe you can just go through that. And Grant, maybe this is
Well,
you.
yeah, I love picking on the ISP because they suck our time, much like all of our clients' times, and I'm sure anybody that that's listening can have a war story about ISP. So here we go with the ISPs. So yeah, I mean, obviously, being mindful of the time you spend on something, that adds up very, very quickly, and really ask yourself, am I the most efficient use, or am I the most efficient person to use for this type of event? The answer is rarely no. I mean, obviously, if you don't have somebody to turn to, then that's your only choice.
Mhm.
But owners of companies, managers of companies, engineers of companies are going to be your highest payroll people. They may be the only people in your organization that are qualified to hop on that call, but at the same time, there's other methodologies. Having somebody, an IT person that is qualified to be on that phone for you at a lesser dollar is much more effective. The other one I hear a lot is, and you point out that is the vendor giving you respect. So vendors are going to speak in languages that you do not understand intentionally. And so in some cases, they might even be slightly condescending, because you are coming at and you're asking them questions, or I'm sorry, they're asking you questions that you can't answer. And they're going to talk in languages of IP addresses and routers and cables and things like that, which that's not the average person's part of the vocabulary. Maybe a little bit more nowadays, but still they're going to ask things that you don't understand, and nor should you have to. And when you aren't able to answer the questions, they're going to go down the script to a T, right? So,
Well, and here's the one that happens to me, or at least I've gotten trained to do this, is I might call the same company two or three times until I get a rep that can actually help me.
it,
And it's like,
yeah, no,
come on.
that's a thing. No, you're going to have some level of inconsistency, and the first thing out of a vendor's mouth, ISPs, is it's not their fault every time. Like, I don't know if that's what they're trained to do, but that's what happens every single time. And so we, as the IT provider, we have to be able to prove to them why it's their fault. I'm like, I'm in the wrong business, right? I wish I could. I mean, I don't wish this, but how nice would it be if I can just, like, a client calls me up and I'm like, wasn't me, wasn't me, I didn't do it, right? Like, I mean, that's the opposite effect of a customer service, and,
Yeah.
and so it blows me away that that's the first thing out of their mouth is, it's not us, we're fine, it's totally you guys, and the reality is that most of the time it's them, and it's not that it's not at their central office necessarily, but it's definitely down the block from the client, and it's not the client's responsibility. So having somebody that's in your corner that is able to not only put the ISP, obviously vendor, in their place, quickly and efficiently, and get the problem solved, saves just a huge amount of inefficiency and money, both on the amount of time that you'd have to be on the phone, but also all the impacts that are happening in the office itself from that type of service outage.
Yeah. This last one is interesting because at some level, businesses who have their own internal staff have an IT and a professional person that functions at that level, but those aren't the folks we're talking about here. We're talking about companies that don't have these professionals in them. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Succurri exists. And Andrew, you used the word advocate when we were talking about this, and I think it might come from your healthcare background, because that's how you need. When you go in and you're talking to a physician, sometimes you need someone there with you who understands the language, like insurance. So I won't even go into that's a whole nother deal, but uh,
Different webinar. Check out our YouTube channel.
yeah, different webinar. But why did you use the word advocate when we were talking about it?
For a lot of reasons. I'll kind of, so you used healthcare, so I'll use the human body as kind of an example to highlight how important this conversation is. It's the cumulative effect of all of these little things that add up and become a real problem, right? So if you have one cut and you got a little bit of bleeding on it, you're going to be okay. It stings, you move on. But they say, like, there's a phrase, what, like, killing you with 1,000 cuts, right? And so if you're bleeding from 1,000 different directions and you can't really see what's happening, your life energy is sapping out of you. And that's what happens to these businesses we see is they have 1,000 little cuts that they can't address, but all they can see is one little drop of blood, or, it's a little stream, and they don't know that, like, they're literally bleeding out. They just can't see it because it's not one gushing mass. And that kind of gets gross, but, so what we need, like in IT, you need to have a really high level of operational excellence to get all the value and the money you're spending, right? Like IT is a cost center for almost every business except ours. And so you have to get the most value possible, because if you have good IT, like if you have operational excellence in IT and your people in your business are working effectively, you are now leveraging those IT dollars to do more with your staff. But if your IT dollars are just bleeding out, you're not getting any value. Your staff isn't getting that boost of efficiency, and so you just basically run out of energy. So I'm going to use the equation here because I wanted to show you. We wanted this to be practical, right? So I used the example before of, like, let's say this takes 4 hours to fix an issue with your internet provider. So you spend 4 hours, let's just say it costs $500 of wasted employee time in your organization. So you fix that issue today, but what if it comes back next month, which it does usually. So now you're fixing it again. So now you've taken your internet connection, which should cost you about $150 a month, and now it costs like $650 a month with you having to manage it. Your time is being sucked away. You're doing this issue constantly. And so this bleed never gets healed. You just you put a Band-Aid on and you move away. So like IT operational excellence then is actually stopping that permanently. So like what we do, and this is where the practical stuff comes in, is that $500 cost, you can use that to actually stop the bleed indefinitely. So what we say is get a second internet connection from another internet provider, use a device, they're called SD-WAN devices, to bond those two connections together. And basically what happens is if one internet provider is having trouble, that SD-WAN device swaps over to the other internet connection instantaneously. And as far as everyone's concerned, your internet just keeps on running smooth as glass. And usually the internet provider that's having problems fixes their issue and you're back up and running. And so what happens now is the office manager, because there's a solution in place to deal with that variability in the internet system, they don't have to deal with it anymore. The system just runs beautifully at that point. So they're still paying $500, right? Because you got your other internet connection and you've got your SD-WAN device, but they have a predictable outcome. Everyone's running at full speed. The office manager never has to use mental energy to fix the ISP again, because you now have redundancy. So that's the practical approach to solving this specific case. But there's, like I said, 1,000 ways you can have operational excellence in IT. So we can move on to the next one. I'll give my next example after we're done with that.
I feel that this is like a segue into our next webinar, because I'm like, I could deep dive on all the other things of inefficiency. So if you have a single ISP, and most of the world is a cloud-based now, right? So now you are 100% dependent on that one ISP, and by design, they will go down for at least 8 hours or more in a year. And so, and that's part of their agreement, right? They're saying that they're going to do this. And so start adding that to your cost of what your ISP costs you, and then having that secondary being able to actually show up on your P&L, right? So you've taken that cost bleed and actually put it to a spot where you can see it and manage it, and then reducing the risk over here. So like I said, I feel this is a webinar for the future, but
it spun off a little bit because I asked about the word advocate, and advocate applies to vendor management. It applies to licensing management. It's people who know what they're doing and go for the solution. They don't try to deflect blame. They don't try to, if the advocate is looking for a solution and they almost don't care except for the solution. And Andrew brought up a real practical solution. If you're having a problem with the internet provider and continued problem, rather than waste money on it and bleed money on it because you're spending time on it, come up with a solution that solves the problem. And they're, Andrew just mentioned one, but advocate is having someone in there that knows what they're talking about.
I call it
That
the
has your
bulldog,
back.
right? I'm the vendor bulldog, where I go in there and when a vendor tells me that it's not their fault, I tear their head off. So that's that's my lack of filter. Andy's representation is much more eloquent, but I just see
Sure.
myself just like tearing people apart. Like, let's go, vendor,
Yeah.
let's do this.
Well, it's amazing what happens when you know the lingo,
Right.
because you actually know what's going on.
Well,
You
and you
weed
call them
out
out.
who you're talking to real quick.
Yeah, you call them out on it too. I'm like,
Yeah.
sometimes the things that you hear come out of you're like, that isn't a thing. That does not exist.
So licensing is another area. When I first have working with you guys and really understanding what this meant, I always thought in the example of like what you guys were saying was, oh, Susan bought this license, single user license for this product. Tony bought this single user license for this product. We're all using it. Shouldn't we be on a team license model? What does that look like? Are we paying? Like, that's where my brain went when we first started talking about this. But there's also another part of this, which is when people leave the organization and you continue, like, no one has their eyeballs on it. And so you just continue to pay for this licensing. And I was like, oh,
or you make it worse and you buy more because you don't know that these licenses exist.
for
And so
someone who doesn't even work for you anymore.
right. And so like there's just this compounding problem where the bills get bigger and bigger. And one of the other ones that happens too is the upgrade, right? So the continual upgrade, or like, I need this type of license, which is happens to be the most expensive version, but they're not using those functions. And so understanding what is the actual license that person needs to have to be able to function and do their job. And so, I mean, the upgrades sometimes are more expensive than just the base license. And so it starts kind of shooting off in all different directions of how large licensing providers, we will not name names, are there to suck your money out of your company.
So I put in here buy in bulk. We talked a little bit about the analogy of when you go to a grocery store and you see two products for the same product, and one's cheaper than the other one, but they're different sizes. And so you look at the cost per unit and you're like, oh, this cheaper one, the cost per unit is, 10 cents more, 20 cents more than per unit on this other one. This other one's more expensive. And so you kind of look at it and go, wow, I'm actually paying more for that product right there for less of it.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of that one. But we didn't want to say this provider's name because we kind of hammer on them all the way through this today. But so, for example, so I have a piece of software that's used to modify documents called PDFs. So I'm sending a shot across the bow there. And then in that same suite, I have something that I use to edit pictures and maybe websites and design software and things like that. And so in that suite, each one of those pieces of software costs $45, right? And so as I'm kind of going through there, I'm like, oh, okay, I need this software, I need this software. And then all of a sudden you add this third software. By adding that third piece of software, you're now close to $150 for those three pieces of software, and that's monthly. However, their all-inclusive package is $99. So the moment and it has like 15 pieces of software in it, so you get the whole suite. But they're not going to tell you that once you go over that third piece of software, that there's a cheaper solution elsewhere, right? So they'll let you buy the entire suite ad hoc and bill you for it and never swap you into the license that is right sized. So understanding where those lines kick in and when it makes sense to have the license swap to the all-encompassing license versus the ad hoc license. So if you only need one piece of software, great, here, go get that one. But understanding what is actually part of the technology stack for the employee, what do they really need to have, and what is the best license to fit that. And so you're not getting upgraded because you don't need it, and you're not being paying too much because you don't need all of it.
And you guys track all the licensing stuff when you manage accounts at certain levels, right?
Yeah.
It depends on the vendor. Like the vendor in question makes it nearly impossible for us to track stuff for a corporate level for all of our customers because transparency facilitates good decision making. So, if you don't have transparency, you can't make good decisions. But we do, like, that is our philosophy, is if we can capture that information, bring it to our customers, like specifically in our life cycle dashboards, like if every quarter I'm reviewing with a customer their list of software, it makes it a lot easier for them to make that one informed, actionable decision versus I'm like, oh, by the way, you need to figure out your software. I'm like, I don't know where to start. Versus I'm like, I recommend you get rid of this extra license because you don't have that person anymore. They're gonna be like, oh yeah, let's do that. And then you're done, right? So decision is minimized, which is a really huge time consumer as well. And action is now highly effective.
So you mentioned lifecycle management. Now, this is hardware or computer lifecycle management. You're kind of mentioning software lifecycle management, licensing lifecycle management. But now this is kind of the biggest one that we see, right?
It's my favorite equation.
And it's really inefficiency around the use of computers and the life cycle of computers because let's face it, they're not inexpensive to buy a new computer, and it's not like you buy a new computer every year or need to buy one every year, but you do need to watch out for issues that start popping up. And you guys see it in the form of help desk requests. Oh, we're getting a help desk request for this, for this, for this.
Well, yes, that, but also this is my shout out to all the believers of like, that computer still turns on, I'm not replacing it. Because it happens a lot, right? They're like, hey, the only way that's getting shut off and removed is if it catches on fire. And that's a really, really expensive decision to make. And so shout out to those.
Yeah.
Pay attention to the equation.
Well, it's a limiting belief in that they're saving money because they're not having to spend money on a new computer.
Correct.
Just that simple. So, Andrew, why don't you take us through this whole time loss, calculation?
Yeah, so certainly. And do you have some numbers? Like if you hit the next slide, so perfect. There we go. So when I talk with customers, especially like anyone who's still in the business that's like 55 and older, they came from a generation where computers lasted 10 or 15 years. Like when I started my career, that was like the end of that cycle, but I saw 10 and 15-year-old computers and they ran great. But ultimately, the computer industry shifted and they build in obsolescence. So at the 5-year mark, computers start to age and have catastrophic failures, and just the weight of new technology innovation really slows them down, and your staff are affected by that. So when I talk with someone who is of this mindset of like, we buy a computer and it lasts 10 years and we're good, I'm like, well, I want to like give you a sense of actually the impact to that thought process, right? Because we're highlighting these invisible bleeds. So if you have someone that's an employee and let's say, or every one of your employees loses 5 minutes every day due to computer inefficiency, which like, I'm pretty sure everyone in like the world would say, well, yeah, there's probably 5 minutes of lost time on my computer. So if you can get rid of that, you're going to see here in a second how compelling the equation is. So if you assume, and let's like, we're going to be really conservative here, 5 minutes lost a day and that's it. And let's just say people only really work 6 hours of that 8 hour day, right? So that's 1,500 hours a year that you could potentially maximize. That is 125 hours a year that you have lost for that 5 minutes a day. So you take that, you multiply it by like an average salary of, let's say, $35 an employee, which is probably with benefits, the least expensive person in your office. That equals $4,375 a year of bleed, right? So like if you're looking at your company per employee, right? So if you're looking at your company and you're like, man, we're just like struggling to find resources to move the business forward. We're just worn out. We always have all this headwind against us. And if you look at it from like a technology standpoint, if everyone in the company is losing that much enterprise value, $4,375 a year, you're like, oh, well, that's where we can't move forward on this, right? So you take that $4,375 and then you look at what it would cost to replace that computer, which is probably about $1,500. So all of a sudden, you're like giving back to your organization, what is that, $3,500 ish, or like $2,000 ish. That's a lot of extra value you get back, right? And so this is where operational excellence in the IT world comes from, because it takes organizations like us to have so many thousands of computers we manage, the analytics we have to look at them, like just having to do this because we have so many machines we have to do life cycle for, to come up and say, like, that's where you're bleeding. You'll never see it. It's not on your profit and loss. Your employee will never recognize it, but we know because we track it across such a large breadth of computers. So the goal is transform that loss back into usable cash in your business in the form of efficiency.
Well, this is interesting too, because not everybody lives in a silo. And so if you have one person that, especially, I know I've been in organizations where the owner will have an issue, and now the owner brings in like 2 or 3 people on that because that owner doesn't know how to fix something. And so they call in Ted, who's really good at finance and, or sales or something. And he's helping out, maybe not sales, those guys,
Hey,
somebody in operations that knows how to use technology, right?
or their uncle works at Microsoft, or
yeah. And so now that person's like a black hole of time that everybody, okay, we got him back up and running. That's great. Now everybody gets back to doing their thing. And so this doesn't live in a silo. It doesn't live in a vacuum. When this stuff happens, when you start having people lose efficiency, not to mention, let's say you're paying somebody hourly to help you with your IT. Now you go call them, so-and-so, oh, I downloaded a virus, or, or something. Who knows what, there's all kinds of things that can cause this latency, or not latency, I'm using the wrong word, downtime or lost productivity. For me, I just kind of get up and go, all right, well, my brain's fried. My brain's getting hot. I'll stop and go do something else, or, go down the hall and talk to somebody, or make a phone call that I hadn't been able to make. Or here's the other thing that happens. Oh, I forgot, I had to call to get, I had to go get my wife's tabs on her car or something. And so I go do that rather than stay on what I was working on. You get distracted. We all do it. It's not like it's a unnatural thing, but you just get distracted. But if your tech works, you stay on it. You stay on that stuff. And it's just human behavior. So we talked about the 3 big areas. We kind of went into some detail. Let's start looking at, and Grant, walk us through, this is kind of your way of looking at, because you talk to people all day, every day about, oh yeah, we've got great IT going. Oh, you do? Okay, well, let's have a conversation. And there's
Yeah.
4 different areas that I'm going to show, and each area has a box. And it's kind of hard to see, a little bit hard to see, but each of these areas, this is like internet service provider. Yellow means needs improvement, red needs immediate attention, and green means they're operating at a satisfactory level, and they all get a score. So these first two, there's 4 areas: infrastructure and security. Now, I'm not going to ask you to go through each one of these necessarily, but walk us through how you look at this picture for these 2 areas of a business in terms of IT.
Yeah. So each one of these little boxes is technically it's a key performance indicator or KPI that how we measure IT, or IT infrastructure, IT management. Each one of these has its own unique potential impact on a business. So obviously ISPs, been hammering on those guys pretty hard today. So I'll move past, but like backup and disaster recovery, workstations that like there's time loss, there's risk associated with them, and so they all have their own little special components that add up to either risk or loss. And I say I won't go through each one of them because we can be here for another couple hours. But my process is I go through and ask these questions of potential customers, prospects, and we even use it in our client base. And asking like obviously the client base, we know the information, but the prospects, as we go through, I'm like, hey, tell me about this. Tell me about your internet. How are you doing things? And I just make some little check boxes on there, and fill in what they're talking about. And in the process, it's very straightforward. I leave my opinions out of it. I will tell you, if anybody knows me, keeping my mouth shut and is difficult for me. But I just I go through the process and just take down what they say, and then I go back in and go through and check all this off. And then ultimately, what I'll do is I'll put it up against best practices, right? Show the next slide there. So this is talking about support services and advanced security services. These are all, like I said, all components that are making up your IT infrastructure, and different controls or different functions. But going through that process, then I put together an analysis for that person I'm working with, and to show them sometimes, and I would say 99% of the time, when I start having a conversation with somebody, they're going to tell me that their IT is great, right? And good. I'm glad it's working for them. What they're not seeing is a lot of that bleed. And so this report does a really good job of pointing out where their shortcomings or deficiencies. So and also we're able to point out exactly where what their actual number of financial bleed is as well. So it goes from like their effective IT costs, sort of kind of bounce it through there. And so they have, so I asked the question of like, what are they spending on their monthly on their P&L? So that's actual captured costs. And then this report is able to produce roughly what they're actually spending in IT, also known as the silent IT bleed. And the number is typically thousands of dollars more than what they're actually spending on a P&L for. So it becomes pretty game changing. I've seen a lot of people kind of look at me and just go, I cannot believe that I've ever had something so concrete show me what I'm doing wrong, even though I thought I was, doing everything right. And the goal isn't to show, to like, oh, look at you guys need help. Everybody needs help. I mean, IT is a journey. You have to start somewhere, but understanding where to start is a really key component of this report, right? So obviously the reds, you start working on the reds, then you go to the yellows, and then the greens. Maybe you start doing some improvement on the greens, but it's a really powerful tool.
So the thing that I kind of have a piece of this slide here that's missing, that's on the other one, so I apologize for that. But the way my lizard brain worked was, okay, we're either at yellow, red, or green in these specific areas for infrastructure or security or managed support, or advanced security. And we're currently spending a certain amount a month on that to get that level of IT support, we'll just say overall. If we were to change some of these things and move them to green, not only would we reduce the bleed in these areas that we know exist, so pick the red boxes where you see the bleed happening. If you're spending that, but you're saving so much more because now you're not bleeding anymore in those areas. Is that a fair way to look at how this works?
That's exactly how, like, so the ones in red are critical. And so they may have something to do with a financial bleed. They may be a security risk, which is, it could be a financial risk in the near future. Like I said, not doing something doesn't mean it's not going to cost you something. It's just maybe it's been deferred. So if it's a security event, those are company ending, type scenarios. So it's going to cost you. It's a question of how much. So the report does the financial side of it. It does the security side of it, and it also does the support and service side of it as well. So all those key components of really understanding where your risks lie, where your money is going, and the value that you're getting for the money that you're spending.
The other thing I like about this is it's pretty clear on when customers or clients first come to you to say, all right, well, let's fix these things. Here's some things we got to patch right away or fix right away.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have
Doesn't mean
an
we do
action
it
plan.
all at once, but now you
No.
have a clear plan. Like, okay, here's all the reds and here's a few we need to get green right now because they're high risk, high cost. But here's some other ones that maybe we move to yellow from a red.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you have kind of this plan over time.
It gives you a roadmap, and
Roadmap. Thank you.
and that's the key. Like I said, IT is a journey. Cybersecurity is a journey, right? And you have to start somewhere. And once you start getting on that road and you have a map to getting to where you need to go, and like Andrew talks about operational excellence, these are all things that will give you a roadmap to that operational excellence. And when you get those items to green, then you're good, right? You've done everything that to save yourself money and efficiency.
So let's I think it's pretty clear the one thing we want people to remember here, and it's really about stopping the bleed. I want to leave time for questions if we have them, and make sure we get in there. But stopping the ID bleed, but first look at those three places, right? Look at your spend, your hidden cost potential. If you can have someone like Grant evaluate what's going on, because he has a kick-ass process. So he's not going to miss anything. And it's a fair assessment of what's going on based on over a decade of experience doing that. So I'm going to put in that word for you. If you guys want to add, Andrew or Grant, you want to add anything that if there's one thing that you want people to take away from this?
Yeah, I actually encourage people that like are really happy with the way that their IT is today. Those are the best ones, right? Because at bare minimum, I'm giving them affirmation that they're doing the right thing and they're on the right path. It's so often I have a call where they're on the opposite side of the spectrum and they've got so much work to do and it's really frustrating. It's nice to have somebody on the other side of going, hey, I really like my IT. And I can either affirm it or say, hey, yes, you're doing good, but here's some room for improvement. So it is nice to have some of those nice wins. So I encourage anybody that's, not happy with their stuff or really, really happy with what they're doing. And at bare minimum, I'm gonna at least be able to confirm what your thought process is.
Yeah. And what I would say too, for any business, and Grant, like actually the ones that say they're really happy are usually the ones that are the most blind to the bleed, because in their Yeah,
Grant's being
they're
nice
the ones.
today.
Yeah, they're the ones that are like, oh, I checked that box, right? Like my perception is I checked that box, but you can only manage what you measure. And so like this is why we use this philosophy is that we're measuring effectiveness of their IT operations. And so like this cost analysis tool is not a magic like free giveaway for this webinar. Like we'll do it for anybody, any organization that wants to talk with us. We'll go through and do that. One, because we want to help companies get a better sense of where they're at and provide transparency, right? So we do it as a community outreach. Obviously, we want to get customers from it, but if you don't measure something, you can't manage it. And then it turns into an absolute disaster that you had no idea about. So ultimately, my feeling is like, get measured, know where your problems are at least work through them. And if you're all green, like I will literally take you out to lunch because it has never happened. But I'd love to see that. That one will go like on the wall, right? We'll print that one out, put it on the wall.
We'll frame that bad boy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And Tony, just because we are close to the top of the hour, so we just need to watch the time here carefully.
Yep. Trying to fast forward us here. Does anybody have any questions out there that they'd like to ask? You just put them in the chat there, and we'll answer them. Also, you can always follow up with us if we've got some questions.
Yeah, so there's a question I saw that just came across, and it's actually an interesting one that we're working through and seeing a lot more now is what do you do when there's like shame and guilt associated with the like businesses have a lot going on, right? And you have to focus on areas. So how do you address what might be a shameful or a guilty part of a business that someone doesn't want to look at? And so, like my suggestion on this, and I think Grant really phrased this well, is IT is a journey. It's not a destination. There should be no guilt associated with how the information or the IT has been run. We just need to start, right? We need to start on the path and start having a proactive plan to fix things. Every company we work with that has a plan makes tremendous strides in the first year. I mean, even in the first few months, they're usually patching their really egregious vulnerabilities and the things that are at the highest level of risk. So like for us, I say, don't be ashamed, just be aware to be transparent, and let's all work through it together.
Well, the thing that's cool about what you guys do is you can take steps without spending a dime, except for some of your time.
Yeah, I did a webinar yesterday with Economic Alliance, shout out. And that was one of the things I'm like, there's some key things that you don't have to spend any money on, and you can fix a lot of problems. And so there are those out there that are no cost, high value solutions. You just have to know where to look.
Yeah, we should do a webinar on the fear behind spending money, like the psychological fear. But what happens when you spend the money in the right spot? It transforms things, and you go, why didn't I do that like forever ago? But that's what I'm saying. You don't have to spend money right away to go through this process. In fact,
it's like real estate, Tony. It's always expensive today and really cheap tomorrow.
Yeah.
So if you want to go through this process with Grant, scan this. It'll take you to a page where you can request to schedule some time with him to go through this for your business. I'll leave it up here. We put this out on our YouTube channel. So this video is there. You can fast forward it. There's our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Succurri. 2 C's, 2 R's, 1 I. Actually, 2 U's as well. I forgot about that. I should start saying that. It means it's Latin for to serve or something like that.
To assist and support. Support and assist.
It's actually a derivative of to assist. And I was told by someone who in Latin, I was told by an Italian speaker that in Italian it actually has references to rescue, which I thought was wonderful. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I'll put this.
So we will assist and we will rescue as you need us to.
Nice. Nice. Hey, everybody, thank you so much for hanging on if you hung to the end. If not, watch this out on YouTube.